We're making adjustments to the sound, and it seems to get, I think we got her, but didn't quite solve it. We'll see. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Next week I'll have audio playing. I think you'll hear that okay. Just so you can hear my voice. And I'll try to remember to project, but hopefully you'll hear it. We'll make them understand. Okay, let's begin with the word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to learn of the resurrection of your Son from the dead. That we would be able to know that what he has said when he was here and what you have told us in your word is true and that you are faithful. Help us, Lord, to open our eyes and hearts and minds today to receive your truth. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. Well, not sure where the sweet spot will be, but I think I'm a little bit. Maybe that's even better if I say that again. I don't want to stay too far back. Anyway, thanks. I got a little bit of a late start, so I had to cut my timer short, but really there's about 300 verses in the New Testament pertaining to the resurrection. So there's a lot to choose from. This is one I like, and there's many, of course. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice. By the man he has appointed, he has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. This is Paul speaking on Mars Hill. And so it's a nice one. And this verse, because I live, you also will live. From the same chapter our readings were in this morning. Okay, so this is week 4 of 6, the empty tomb, which I thought about renaming, but since I started with that, we'll stick with that. And as I mentioned last week, though, I had to tweak it a little bit. We broke it out this way: the crucifixion of Jesus last week, the crucifixion and death, and this week will be the empty tomb, subsequent appearances. Really, it could just be the death and resurrection of Christ. And so we're going to cover these other two topics and be all around them and in between them and so forth today. So let's begin with some thoughts. When we're looking at evidence, when we're looking at the New Testament and talking about a manuscript of the New Testament and talking about the words that are on that manuscript, how do we know that this is God's word? And these other so-called books of the Bible, what are sometimes called the apocryphal books, but you're not supposed to use that term because it pre-biases the listener, so you're supposed to use the extra canonical books of the New Testament. That's the new politically correct way, I guess. Anyway, I'll use either. The extra canonical books. How do we know they're not in the Bible, but the books we have are in the Bible? There's a lot of reasons, but here's a partial list of things that I mentioned them early so that you can keep your mind on these things as we go through today's talk. But here's some of the stuff that critics look for as they look at these manuscripts and try to decide, hey, is this part of the original Bible that the church held as delivered by God? Or is this something, is it not that? And of course, critics then don't believe anything was delivered by God, so they go off on a totally different thing. One of the things that I found frustrating, just an aside, is that a lot of this will be oriented toward critics. What do the critics say about the resurrection, and the unbelievers, and the skeptics? And that's important, but I think it's also important as believers that we get assured in our faith that Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. And so sometimes I just don't care what the critics think. For instance, the critics only accept 7 of Paul's epistles. There's 13 in the New Testament from Paul with his name on them. Critics accept 7 of those. Okay, well, they're wrong. That's normally I would start there, and then I would look at verses from any of Paul's epistles to make a point that Paul was making. And so, but I'll focus for most of this on the ones they accept: Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, and so forth. And so I have a foot in both worlds. I just want to kind of clarify that in terms of where I'm coming from on some of this stuff. But generally, New Testament scholars, whether they're in secular universities or seminaries, these are some of the things they look at when they are looking at a manuscript or at a certain book. Early sources. Is it an early manuscript? Eyewitness sources behind that. External corroboration. We looked at some of that with our archaeology archaeology kind of review that we did the first week of this class, and it just keeps coming. As I'm putting together another set of slides for some future class maybe. So Simon of Cyrene. I mentioned that we had found the ossuary of Caiaphas, the high priest, and his family. Found that ossuary, set of ossuaries. That's kind of in the top tier. There are 7 New Testament people that are absolutely affirmed by history as being, we found all kinds of archaeological and external corroboration of their existence and of their life, and it dovetails nicely with the Gospels. Simon, remember Jesus' cross was carried by Simon of Cyrene, and Mark adds, the father of Rufus and Alexander. Well, because probably he was an important person in the early church. They knew who he was, and by time, those are like footnotes. And these are other people, and by recording this in the gospel, the early church would know, oh yeah, I know Alexander. Anyway, so we found his son, Alexander's ossuary. And it says son of Simon, but it doesn't say of Cyrene. But Simon's a very common name, like Peter, very common name. So maybe this is in the second tier because Simon is such a common name. But next to him, they found his sister, who was from the town. There's 5 towns in the Cyrene area, and his sister is from one of these named towns of Cyrene. And so the son is also Alexander of Simon, is also going to be from the Simon of those same towns. And anyway, it just it's not 100%. What they really like is rock solid confirmation from archaeology. This was second tier, but it's still interesting, and I'll bring that forward. Anyway, external corroboration, I'll bring that forward in a future day, we'll see. External corroboration is good, but it's not the only thing. There's are many here, multiple attestations, either in the same book or genre or period or time. Enemy attestation. If you have an enemy of Napoleon saying, oh, he was short, he was a bum, he smelled bad, he's just ugly, but boy, was he an amazing general. Well, that enemy attestation is considered pretty important in the eyes of critics because he's saying something, it's an enemy pointing out some great feature of the one they're talking about. So they really like enemy attestation, critics especially. We'll see some of that. Like criterion of embarrassment, little things that normally wouldn't be recorded, but because they're there and they're kind of embarrassing, it helps to support the concept of authenticity, or the notion of authenticity of this thing. A couple examples: the women discovering the body, women's testimony in court. In Sharia law, it's 2 women for every man. That's how they do it. That's why it's so hard for women under Sharia law to convict a rapist, because if they're the only 2 present, it's difficult, because their testimony is worth half of his. Having the women discover the tomb, if you were going to make this story up, you'd have the stalwarts of the community discover the tomb. There's other things, like Peter denying Jesus 3 times, or Paul being a persecutor of the church, or James not believing who Jesus was. We'll get into all those things. There's several things that make for the criterion of embarrassment. Having the first gospel authored by Matthew. One of the things we find from the critics, they don't accept the Gospels. And that's why I'm moving all that to a different class, is because there's reasons we absolutely should accept the Gospels, but the critics don't. Generally, they downplay Bart Ehrman, oh, you can't trust the Gospels and so forth. There's a lot of reasons for this. But, and I won't go into them here because they do get pretty interesting and deep. The 4 Gospels that we have are all from the 1st century. None of the other Gospels are from the 1st century. They're all from 2nd century, some are as late as the Middle Ages. Another neat thing you notice is that the 4 Gospels have these very authentic names. Papias, I believe, was the church father who tells us Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Only we've lost all the manuscripts of Papias, but we have quotations of him from another church father. There's this ecclesiastical continuity from the early church, from Clement of Rome and Polycarp. Polycarp studied under John, Clement studied under Peter. These guys were connected to the apostles, and then they continued this line of ecclesiastical continuity, is what I call it. And we have their testimonies about this and that and the other thing, and I think it's very valuable in terms of explaining what was going on. Well, you get to these later Gospels, I'll call this one the Gospel of Peter. I'll show you a quote from that today. Or the Gospel of Barnabas. They attach these big important names to them. the four Gospels, John, he's an important person in the early church, but Matthew, as I mentioned last week, he's the tax collector. Why would you name your first Gospel after the one of the least liked disciples? Mark, who was nobody, and he was under Peter. Just only for point of accuracy that we point out that it's Mark. He probably got a lot of this stuff from Peter. It's probably the earliest Gospel. We'll look at some stuff from Mark. Anyway, because the critics downplay the Gospels, which is they're wrong, but because they do, I will use other sources to show the resurrection. Again, it's just the whole New Testament is built around this event, and they love Paul, and they love Paul's letters because they start Paul. He names who he is when he starts writing his letters in many of these cases. Hebrews, of course, we don't know. But Paul for sure. When he says Paul, they say, yep, that's Paul. Galatians, they love Galatians, a relatively early letter. And he says, if this is me, and Bart Ehrman, yeah, this is Paul's letter. So, okay, what did Paul say about the resurrection? We'll go there. And less from the Gospels, although there's no reason as a Christian you shouldn't. And then the lack of legendary or theological embellishment. I'll talk about this when we get to the Gospel of Peter. But basically, have you ever noticed the Gospel stories of the crucifixion and the resurrection and the burial, it's all very sober. It's very matter of fact. There's not really a lot of emotional things introduced there. It's just here's the facts and laid out. Okay, if you look at, and actually the resurrection's not there. I mean, there's the empty tomb. They show up, the tomb is empty. The closest you get to the resurrection event is in Mark, when the women show up, and it says they started heading toward the tomb, and then it describes the earthquake and the stone rolling away. It doesn't say they were standing there when it happened. They don't describe the resurrection. So actually, even in the Gospels, we don't see the resurrection happening. Okay, I think that's a sign of authenticity. What do you see in the Gospel of Peter? We're going to fill out all the details now. So we have the Gospel of Peter. The stone rolls away. The two angels come out first. They're as tall as the clouds. This is the 100-foot tall resurrection. Jesus comes out. He's taller than the two angels that are tall as the clouds. So he comes out. He's taller than the angels, taller than the clouds. And then the voice from heaven asked a question, did you preach to the guards who were sleeping? And the cross comes out of the tomb next. How it got in there, I'm not sure. The cross comes out of the tomb and it talks. The talking cross comes out and tells God in heaven, yeah, we told those soldiers how it was. Basically says, yeah. So the point being, if you just take a look at these extra canonical works, they just don't work. They fall so flat. As a Christian, your spirit will, I think, illuminate within you that these are bogus. I call them spurious when we get to that. But one of the reasons they're bogus is that they have all of these legendary and theological embellishments. That's what happens over time with these kinds of things. Legends happen, theology gets enhanced. Oh, we want to fit this in. You know, if they were crafting the New Testament to solve theological problems, well, then you would have Jesus say something about circumcision. That was a big fight in the early church. He doesn't say anything about circumcision. Well, why not? If you're going to craft this story, why wouldn't you put in Jesus' mouth the words that would smooth out some of these bumps the early church was having? They don't. We have these accounts of what Jesus said. Some of them are very difficult. A lot of kingdom and God preaching in the synoptical gospels. But we don't see addressing some of the very things the early church would start struggling with right away. So I think that's another sign of authenticity, and that they lack theological embellishment because they knew these problems were coming when they were assembling in the first century. These things were already happening. So anyway, that's a little bit of background. A couple people that are important today for discussing the resurrection. William Lane Craig got his PhD in resurrection, and actually he could get a PhD in studying that in a German school. And he's very good. He's a very good debater. He's not my favorite, but he's pretty darn close. He's very good. He's a little heady, and sometimes he's smarter than the people he's debating, and so you really have to follow his arguments, because they're not. But it's fun. Nobody beats this guy in a debate. So I'm going to list him first. 4 basic facts. Jesus was buried. And I mentioned this kind of like our agenda. Some basic things even the critics accept. They don't accept the resurrection, but they'll agree to these 4 basic facts. Historians, critics, and so on. people that are trained. Now, you get on the internet, you get on YouTube, you get in a chat room, oh, Jesus never existed, mythicists. No, even atheist scholars don't believe that. But if you get someone credentialed in ancient languages or in ancient history, they credentialed from any respectable university, they don't hold that Jesus didn't exist. We're talking the 99% view that Jesus obviously existed. He's the best attested person of history. And so, and they realize that by the time they get through their PhD programs. But, so these are the four things that almost everyone is agreeing to. Jesus was buried by and in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. We talked about that last week. On the Sunday following the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. And that's where we're going this week. On multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. You know, it's funny when you read atheists saying, yeah, these people thought they saw Jesus. And it's not just one. I'll say this a couple times. Hallucinations are very personal experiences, but group hallucinations people tend to not have. You don't have 50 people seeing the same hallucination. The closest thing you have to that are the appearances of Mary. That you hear of this town, and everybody in the town says, oh, Mary's appeared on the side of this barn or something. That's the closest you come, and there's some issues with that. So we'll hold that for a thought for a minute. The original disciples believed that Jesus was risen from the dead, despite their having every reason not to. And we'll look at why. And, of course, then they turned the world around, which is even Mark Ehrman admits this. Gary Habermas, last 2 years ago, sent his magnum opus. This guy is Mr. Resurrection. He's written a 5,500-page book on the resurrection. It'll be in multiple volumes. The first volume, I believe, is 1,300 pages. And I think it covers these 6 basic. He uses what's called a minimal facts approach. Well, and there's 12, but of the 6 that he will stand rock solid on against anyone in the world, that's his credential. He doesn't bother with non-credentialed people. These are the 6. First of all, what's the criteria to be in the 6 club? 2 things: substantial, and by substantial, I've watched about 4 lectures from him now. 20 or so evidences for each point. About 20 evidences for each point get you into the club. And it's agreed upon evidences across, the critics and the Christian scholarship. With critically ascertained independent lines of argumentation, that's number 1. Number 2 is historicity of occurrence agreed to by most credentialed scholars. And you point out, this is less important than number 1. By the way, I referenced the article. You can go to the PDF if you want to. It's in the notes. If you didn't get the notes, there's notes floating around. There are 2 pages. It says at the bottom, page 1, page 2. So if you're on page 2, it might not make sense yet. Make sure you're on page 1. If you're following along, you don't have to. Anyway, people change their minds, and who are these critics, and why should we believe them? So number 2 is not as important, but it is a notable thing when all the critics also agree. So that's his minimal facts. Here they are. Jesus died by crucifixion. We covered that last week. No serious scholar. Islamists believe he didn't, but that's fine. After the crucifixion, the disciples had experiences they believed were appearances from the risen Jesus. You're going to see real parallels here between him and William Lane Craig. The disciples' lives were transformed by what they believed they saw. They went out and changed the world. The resurrection was taught very early. That's where we're going to spend some time today. This is pretty exciting, and it's what Habermas has been pushing for a few years now. That many scholars, even skeptics, agree this all began within a year or 2 of the resurrection, 3 years. Habermas does this 5-year timeline starting with the date of the crucifixion, and it's either 30 or 33. It's not really in between. The moon has to be in the right spot for the crucifixion, and the whole Passover weekend, based on all the other evidence we have in the New Testament. So it's 30 or 33 are where the scholars are sitting today. One of those 2 dates. Pick either one. Within 5 years, you've basically got all of the core teachings of the church in terms of Christ. Christology, the divinity of Christ, and the death and resurrection. It's all there very, very early, which compared to any other religion in the world, I mean, Buddhists are 1,000, 1,500 years. The earliest thing we have on Buddha, and Zoroaster is like 1,000 years. The first thing we have, we can't get anywhere near as close to the founder of any world religion as we can Christ. And we've been holding up our the text of the New Testament as being amazing because they date to the 1st century, and we have manuscripts dating to the 2nd century. Well, here we have events that we can corroborate through a lot of different angles that began very early, within just a couple of years, which to me smacks of the authenticity that we have here. Enemy attestation, 2 examples that he will put out, Saul of Tarsus and James. And so certainly an enemy in the case of Saul, and maybe you wouldn't call James an enemy, but they thought Jesus was crazy. His family did, and we'll get to that. So what's our agenda for today? And we're going to go through these kind of points. It was difficult. I like to just have this unfold like a nice narrative. There's so much evidence from so many different quarters that I had a little trouble assembling that. So I wanted to put those kind of unifying themes up first. And then we're going to talk about all this stuff. Historicity tied to the burial. That takes care of a couple of objections. Remember we said last week how Josephus testified and gave the reasons Jews buried crucifixion victims. There was a lot of reasons why we didn't lose track of the body. Bart Ehrman tried this for a while. Well, they threw the body in the ditch. No, that didn't happen. His family was there. Nobody's just going to let that happen. And they buried crucifixion victims. We touched on that last week. But the historicity of the resurrection, to have an empty tomb, you have to know which tomb it is. And that seems very basic, but you have to take baby steps with these critics. They just are. They're not that they're dense. They're really intelligent. They will shoot any angle or hole they can in an argument. So you have to take these inch by inch steps to get them to the point of, okay, yeah, the tomb's empty and he appeared to people, but that doesn't mean there's a resurrection. Well, at some point you do have to give up on the critics. We'll look at the disciples here, we'll look at the post-resurrection appearances, and just some different things. Creeds in the New Testament, this is where we get into, this is kind of the newer concept that Habermas is pushing strong. He said he invented it. Actually, he's quoting other scholars. We'll get to that. We'll look at Paul and James a little more closer, and then we'll look at common objections. And we'll do that all in the next little bit. Okay, why were the disciples afraid? Well, there's several reasons for this. Jesus had just been crucified, and obviously, even from this morning's reading in the church, they really weren't getting it that well. In John 14, we see Philip, well, show us the Father, and then we see Thomas, how do we know where you're going? I mean, they're still a little bit misunderstanding. And Peter said, no, you're not going to the cross. Get thee behind me, Satan, that whole event a little earlier. And so we have a lot of just evidence for surrounding that, but here's the key point I want to point out today. It's the same verse I put up last week. Jesus, it's from Deuteronomy. If someone's guilty of a capital offense, is put to death. Someone guilty of a capital offense is put to death, and their body is exposed on a pole or tree. There are translations. You must not leave the body hanging on the tree overnight. Be sure to bury it that same day, because anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse. I think they knew this. The Jewish authorities said Jesus is a heretic. He's a false Messiah. The Messiah they anticipated was going to throw off Roman rule, but now he's dead. And in fact, he's been hung on a tree, which according to Deuteronomy means he's cursed. That's what you heretics are. Heretics are cursed. And so their faith is rattled and shattered by the crucifixion event. And that's why they're all crouching in the upper room when Jesus makes his appearance to them. There's a real reason for why they were afraid. So I just want to kind of bring that to your remembrance. Okay. Well, that wasn't the only appearance. This is, it's funny, Habermas in a off-the-cuff conversation, somebody said, what do you mean, what appearances? So he just starts listing them off the top of his head. Well, I'm going to add, so I'm writing them down from the notes as fast as I can. And then I looked up and verified all these different verses. Two of these may be the same, but basically Mary Magdalene, of course, right at the outset, and the other women too. And weaving, I'm not going to spend time today weaving together the resurrection stories, which women got to the tomb when. And Bart Ehrman likes to find these little fissures in the story and say, well, the women said they were too afraid to tell anybody, but then Luke says they went and told everybody. Well, yeah, have you never known anyone to change their mind or to start thinking one way and they start a journey and they end up the journey thinking a different way? I mean, that's hardly concrete refutation of this recording of this event. Anyway, so, but we're not going to, that takes time, and there's some beautiful stuff been done on the weaving together of all the synoptics and John. All the resurrection narratives can be reconciled to each other. Peter, Cephas, First Corinthians. Clopas, that beautiful story of the road to the road to Emmaus. And Luke, and 11 disciples. And then 10 apostles with Thomas absent. That was in John. Then with Thomas showing up a week later. Thomas, doubting Thomas, right? And then we have one of the clearest statements, my Lord and my God, when Thomas finally sees the risen Jesus. Beautiful. 7 apostles in John 21, you have to count them, but they're there. The ones that are named when they are by the Sea of Galilee, and they go fishing. That's 7 right there. Because they're named. And then Matthew just refers to the disciple, appearance to the disciples. 500 brothers at one time. James is noted, and then the apostles of the Mount of Olives right before the ascension, of course, and then Paul as well in his Damascus Road experience. So there's quite a bit of, quite a number of appearances here. Okay, let's talk about New Testament creeds. This is where we get the early idea. It is felt now that there are about 30 of these. And I think it's still arguable, this is still relatively new, but certain sections of the New Testament appear to be little mini creeds buried in the text. So that when Paul is talking, and then you'll see this when you see them quote the Old Testament, and your translation puts a nice little inset. Oh, this is the Psalm. We're quoting Psalm 2 here, and they'll put an inset, and then you come back to the regular letter. Well, these creeds are not offset like that, so you don't see them, and they read in the English translation, they just read as part of the text. But things like Romans 10, verses 9, that if you believe in your, confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead. We're saying that's actually a creed. That's something, that was a phrase or a term that was being used in the early church, and Paul's just plopping it in here, and then he explains around it. Well, how do they know that? So there's a whole set of criteria, and I didn't want to get into it. It gets into a bunch of details that I can't do because I'm not Greek. Even Habermas, who says, I've got a minor in Greek, it's deeper Greek than I can do. But the couple of clues they have, the mentioning of Aramaic words that are woven into it, because the Aramaic was the older language. New Testament being written in Greek, but Aramaic is kind of the language that they were speaking. The mentioning of, I received this, or this was given to me, or as you have seen it written. There's also a certain cadence that you can't see in the translation, but you can see it in the Greek, and that's where you have to get into pretty fancy Greek. So, is this rock solid? No, but it's pretty interesting after you see a number of these, and I'll give you an example of one that is obvious that Paul uses. For I received from the Lord and also passed on to you, and you'll recognize this from the Gospel. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way after he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. And this was in a creedal form when Paul references it in 1 Corinthians. And again, there's about 30 of these, and they're important because you have to sort of put this together. What was happening right after the resurrection was, it's called the homologia. This idea that the church was basically seeing 3 things. The divinity of Christ, because he predicted his death and resurrection, and he had been associating himself with God. The death and the resurrection. Those 3 things were the core message of the church. They hadn't figured out all the other stuff yet, but the divinity, the death, and the resurrection of Christ. In fact, Habermas makes a pretty strong point, and I agree with it. The early Christology is very high. The critics, the Bart Ehrmans, like to say, well, that whole Jesus as God thing, that came about 100 years later. It took a while for the church to step up to that. No. You can go to the earliest texts and the earliest quotes and see the divinity of Christ. You see Christ saying it himself most clearly in John. John is very clear. It's like, okay, here's your last chance to get this. But it's in Mark chapter 2 when he forgives sins. And in one debate, Ehrman's confronted with that. And he says, oh, come on, the priest forgave sins. And there's a debate, so there's a lot going on. Here's what's missed. The priest forgave sins strictly in accordance with God's methodology for working through the sacrificial system to forgive sins. No priest was walking around Jerusalem, oh, I forgive yours, I forgive. No, no, no. This is why Jesus got the reaction he did. When he forgave sins, and the Pharisees, like, their jaws pop open. Who is this? Only God forgives sins. And Jesus is just forgiving sins. That's in Mark chapter 2. They consider Mark the oldest gospel. So you can take it way back. Anyway, so the early Testament, not just from the Gospels, which are actually assembled, 40, 50, 60, 70 AD, maybe as late as 90 for John, but in the letters of Paul, which date as early as 48 AD, and we have very evidence that goes back and back and back, further, closer to the resurrection, and some of it is revolving around these creeds. Again, there's 30. There's one. I'll mention one more, and then we'll keep going. The Shema, the Hebrew, they have the Shema. Oh, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And there's a creedal formula in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 that they think may be a Christian twisting of that or a rephrasing of that references God and Christ. And they think that may be one reason Paul was so angry at early Christians and wanted to. The Christians are walking around with these statements, worshiping Jesus as God, that was angering any Orthodox Jew. Paul was very angry when that's why he wanted to go to Damascus and do some more persecution. He wanted to get as much persecution as he could. Anyway, we see these creedal forms popping into the text. Now, what's that mean? Well, it means first they held a belief, then they codified it into something that was memorable and repeatable and that the church could share. And, many of you, if I said, sometimes you feel like a nut, sometimes you don't. Or if I said, where's the beef? You know there's something more to that than me just popping that out. That's actually part of a tradition and a little phraseology that is common and known amongst the people. So you start with these common beliefs. They grew into these common phrases or creeds. There's many words you can use instead of creed, but they're basically these little mini creeds, and they in turn point to the earlier held beliefs. That was why the creed got accepted. They creedalized, gave it a creedalized form so they could be shared and so forth. Okay. Earliest creed, pretty much agreed to by the scholars, and I'll show you why in a second. This I'm breaking out like your next translation, your next translation of the Bible may break it out like this. For I deliver to you as of first importance. And that tells us, first of all, what I also received. So we see some clues about why this is Paul's delivering to them what he received. B, it's of first importance. This is core stuff of the Christian message, of the Christian faith. This is 1 Corinthians 15, the great resurrection chapter of Paul's letter. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. It sounds kind of like the Apostles' Creed. And that he appeared to Cephas, Aramaic name for Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. And then, as if Paul's making a little side comment, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. So we have Paul mentioning, as he's reciting or delivering this creed again, because he said, I already delivered it to you. Remember that. He delivered this to them. He's recalling it in his letter. He's written the letter. He already has visited this church. So this letter is coming a couple of years after. He already delivered it to them when he gave it to when he was there. Okay. And most of them are still alive, but some have fallen asleep, because now we're a year or two later and he's writing this letter. Then he appeared to James. That's very important. Critics love that. Then to all the apostles. Last of all is one untimely word which appeared to me also. So we have Paul's sort of side remarks as he recites this creed. Okay, why is that important? Well, here's what the atheist and skeptical scholars say. This tradition, speaking of 1 Corinthians, that particular passage, we can be entirely confident was formulated as a tradition within months of Jesus' death. Why is it important? The resurrection is a life-changing, world-changing event. The light bulb went on. Use whatever analogy or metaphor you want. Boom, the world changed. And we see the results of that change immediately. That's what you'd expect in the real story. And indeed, now we're finding that real story, and from my Christian bias, being revealed through the text. And even the critics have to deal with this. Paul received the tradition, that is, he was taught it at his conversion. So Paul either actually got this in Damascus. Remember, he was blinded, and then Jesus sent a servant to remove his blindness, and Paul became a Christian convert. Or a couple years later, he received that very early. He received it. So it was already in circulation. This, again, pushes us back very early. And you do believe, or didn't know it goes back to the oldest phase of all history of primitive Christianity. Again, these are notable scholars. He was like the best New Testament scholar in Europe. He died recently, Kurt Lugman. The elements in the tradition are to be dated within the first 2 years of after the crucifixion of Jesus. Paul Barnett within 2 or 3 years of the first Easter. Notice they don't say resurrection because they're skeptics. Richard, these two, from only a few years after Jesus' death. Robert Funk and the Jesus Seminar. Realize the Jesus Seminar, they're the ones who take the red letter edition of your Bible and throw out about 90% of the red. They don't believe Jesus said any of that. They're skeptics, and they don't hold the Gospels in very high esteem. Within 2 or 3 years at most. Within about 3 years, anyway, the number of people here, and I don't know if they're all in your notes, but you get the point. The earliest tradition of all. Where did Paul receive this? If he didn't receive it at his conversion, he received it in his first trip to Jerusalem. And note that this letter is one of the 7 that's accepted from by critics as being from Paul. The Hebrews will argue over it. 2, Paul says, what's he writing Galatians for? It's to get the story straight. The Galatians were kind of wavering. Oh, we need to do more works. How much works, how much gospel? The Galatians were getting a little confused. Paul is setting the record straight. And there's actually the word historizo or something that's used very early in chapter 1 that we know theologically he was trying to get them straight. Salvation by grace through faith. But he also is trying to get the message straight. As we have already said, so now I say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let them be under God's curse. Very harsh words. So when did he go? Well, about 3 years later. Then after 3 years, this is after his conversion, he went to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas, Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. He goes back about 14 years later and sees Peter and James and John. And what's interesting here, you have Peter, James, John, and Paul, 4 critical people in the early life of Christianity. One of the things that Christians aren't using as much as nobody believes a lie and gets killed for a lie, and they believe that the disciples were all martyred. And we have good evidence that the disciples were martyred. We don't have good first century evidence that the disciples were all martyred. We do have good evidence that all 4 of these were martyred. Three first century. James is told by, he was stoned to death in Jerusalem by Josephus tells us that. John was actually, after the exile on Patmos, he comes back to Ephesus for a while, and then there's a 2nd century source that John was martyred. So these were all on the same page. How do we know that? Well, again, from Galatians, I assure you before God that what I'm writing to is no lie, and critics accept this from Paul, and they praise God because of me. So they affirmed Paul's teaching. They said, Paul, you're right on the mark. This is exactly right. And then after the next meeting, they say, okay, you do the Gentiles, we'll do the Jews. And the whole Galatians is a beautiful book. Okay, why is James important? Well, remember, his family, when his family heard about this, they went to take charge of it before they said he is out of his mind. James was one of his brothers. The actual Greek word there is beside himself. It implies he was of 2 minds. They actually thought Jesus was off his rocker. So these are unbelievers. We see it in John. For even his own brothers did not believe in him. So James, what changed James? What changed James so quickly from being an unbeliever to willing to die for his faith? We have to answer that question, and critics will dodge and dance around that. But I think this is evidence that something's happened here. Okay, resurrection. A few objections. The swoon theory. Well, that's that Jesus passed out on the cross. We went through the death of Jesus last night. Nobody's holding that anything. This actually came up in a debate. Jesus had a twin brother who stepped in, stole the body, and became the next Jesus. Now, if you know your Bible a little bit, besides that being laughable, too bad they had to put it into an early 2nd, 3rd century book yet. One of the pseudepigrapha, the non-canonical Gospels. But anyway, what did Jesus show to Thomas? And his hands. Look at my side. How is Jesus' twin going to fake that? Yeah, Jesus wasn't buried, he was misplaced. We talked about that last week, but the historicity of the resurrection is tied to the historicity of the burial. The body was stolen, that's of course the earliest story. And what was the motivation? The disciples were pretty defeated, and so they didn't have the motivation. And if we work through the other characters, who would have stolen the body and why, and how they would have accomplished it, it falls apart. The testimony from the guards who were sleeping at the time, the testimony from sleeping people is not tied. Resurrection appearances were hallucinations. I mentioned that already because they're not just individuals. They are, in some cases, they're also groups. Resurrection was a legendary fabrication over time. This is the thing that is addressed by all this early evidence that the church held to this belief in what they call the homologia, that it became part of these earliest creeds, which are then received and repeated by Paul in his very early letters to the early church. There's no room for this to have occurred. Resurrection will be a miracle, and historians can't speak to whether miracles occurred. This is a presuppositional bias that Bart Ehrman used in his debate with, I think, James White, maybe with William Lane Craig. Historians can't speak to miracles. And I thought, well, how convenient. So he just has to throw his arms up. Yeah, I can't tell you the resurrection happened, because that would be a miracle, and historians can't do miracles. Kind of like when science says, yeah, we can't do anything supernatural for the origin of the world, the universe, or any, the origin of life. No, nor the supernatural. Only materialistic explanations will be allowed in the door. Well, this is the Bart Ehrman version of that. I got to thinking, what if 1000 AD, the heavens opened up, about 1,000 years ago, the heavens opened up, and God appears and tells mankind, and all the world sees it, and everybody's writing it down in whatever language they can. They're scraping it on rocks, they're carving it on wood, and they're painting it on cave walls. God appears and says, hey, humankind, you got this a little off. You need to stop beating your wife. You need to boil water before you drink it. Gives him a few pointers, and then he disappears. What if that had happened? Bart Ehrman would say, I can't speak to it. Even if he had every culture on the planet recording the same event with all this evidentiary documentation, he'd have to say, no, you can't say. It would have been a miracle if that had happened. So there's a problem with these presuppositional biases against reality. I mean, you have to go where the evidence leads. And in the case of the first century, the evidence just after the cross leads to Christ's resurrection. Other disciples made the whole things up so they could become rich as television anchors. I made it that one. I figured they get to, I get to also. Okay. What happened? Did they get, as I mentioned, we have good documentary evidence on the 4 that were in Jerusalem and had that meeting. What about Paul? 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus ones. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in dangers from rivers, in dangers from bandits, in dangers from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. This was the life of the first century Christians who claims to have seen the resurrected Christ. If anybody had a reason to say, okay, I give it up, wouldn't Paul have given it up? He saw the resurrected Christ. I think it's exciting. Anyway, I mentioned the spurious gospel of Peter. We won't go through that. We're out of time. I can give you the idea. So what's the verdict? Here's Sir Edmund Clark, British High Court judge. To me, the evidence is conclusive. And over again, the High Court, I have secured the verdict on evidence not nearly so compelling. As a lawyer, I accept the gospel evidence unreservedly as to the testimony of truthful men to the facts that they were able to substantiate. It's just a guy's opinion, but he knows evidence, he knows legal stuff. Here's my last closing thought for you. This is from leading up to a verse that we hear at funerals. It's a beautiful verse. This is Lazarus was dead, and Jesus finally shows up. Martha runs out and says, Lord. Martha says to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know now that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And we know Jesus' next remark is just beautiful. You should every Christian should know it. I am the resurrection and the life. Beautiful. My question is, why did Martha know this? Martha knew this. I know he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day. I have a couple options. Jesus taught her that because she'd known Jesus for some time, and maybe in his teaching he had explained this. Maybe she knew Psalm 16 where it says, you will not abandon me to the grave. There was some teaching of the resurrection in the Old Testament. But you know, here's my guess, and what I want to point out. Daniel 12:2. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. And this is the resurrection she knew about. She would see the resurrection of Christ very soon after she said that. But I think this is the evidence that she had. And this happens now because Christ is risen. And I love the next verse. And I used to not get this far. But those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So that's my concluding remarks on the resurrection of Christ. Wish we had time for questions. Time's up. And so maybe I'll have time for questions next week. By the way, I'm doing a talk on the stars next Saturday. If you're interested, let's see, you can go to there. There's a conference. I'm just a warm-up act. There's actually two PhD astronomers going to talk. I'm just doing a little intro thing. But that's, you can go there if you're interested in that. So the James Webb Space Telescope, and what it is showing us about those stars, it's pretty amazing. And we get organized. Okay, well, thank you.